G'day folks, thanks for tuning in. Today's video is another hybrid, where we'll be looking at colour theory, but focused on a single miniature, this time Darth Vader from Star Wars Legion. Now Vader's famously dressed in all black, but that doesn't mean he has to look boring. We can use both colour theory and the variety of textures on the Mini to make our model visually interesting while still being ostensibly black. His suit, cape and armour are all going to reflect light differently. Out on the palette I have black spinel, which is a true black pigment with solid staining properties. I also have indigo and Van Dyke brown, which we can mix together to make a chromatic black. Perylene black is a very dark green, similar to indigo in its value and staining properties. These will make up our darks. At the other end we have our lights, titanium white, brilliant yellow pale, and radium blue, turquoise and violet. Out in the middle is Fanchon red and cadmium yellow. These are mostly for the lightsaber, but may come in handy elsewhere, but we'll mostly be focusing on the light and dark sides of the palette. Let's get started. For our foundational layer I'll be using several cheap craft brushes, a pair of size 6 and a pair of 8, all at different stages of life. The more beat up brushes are perfect for broad surfaces, and the newer ones will do well for the small details and hard to reach places. We'll start from the inside out, mixing some perylene black into black spinel for the suit. I often see Vader's suit portrayed as a greenish black leather, so I'm trying to capture that here. I also opt to paint the gloves this way to keep things a little bit simpler. For the cape I'm making a chromatic black out of indigo and Van Dyke brown. We can modulate this by altering our ratios, as I want the ground to be brown, and the underside of the cape will have more brown in it. Now this area is a challenge on an assembled model, so I've cut out several minutes of me trying to cram the brush into the folds without popping his head and shoulders off. I'm also painting the front armour this way for convenience, but as you'll see in a bit we can still make it stand out on its own with our highlight choices. For the inner robes, I'm shifting our black more towards blue, and focusing more heavily on blue as we move towards the outside of the cloak. The lower parts and deepest creases will get more brown again, bringing things closer to black. Finally, I'm painting the helmet straight black spinel to make it stand out totally from the rest. Already at this stage we can see our elements stand out from each other, thanks to the variety in our foundations. This early stage is also a good opportunity to sketch in any object source lighting, as the flexibility of oils means we can push and pull things around later on. I'm blocking in the lightsaber as well as a bit of glow on the glove and the robe, just as a reminder to myself not to paint those areas black. Finally I'm putting some heavily thin Van Dyke brown down on the base, in order to get the paint into every corner of the textured surface. Next we'll be wiping the bulk of this away and layering down our first highlights. This is where cutting your makeup sponges to a variety of shapes and sizes can come in handy, as we can use the smaller ones to get our tighter areas while also minimising cross-contamination. But we'll start with the easy ones. We want to be careful not to apply too much pressure with this step, as we want more of that foundation left to work with. The more we remove, the more dark we'll have to add back in, so we're really going for more of a value sketch this time, removing the bulk of our foundation just from the uppermost areas. Like with the foundation, I'll be using different sized filbert brushes for our initial highlights. It's important from here on out to minimise cross-contamination, so having dedicated brushes for each area will help with that and give us some much needed precision. I'm quickly recreating our chromatic black and then adding some radiant blue before changing my mind and switching to radiant turquoise instead. It really doesn't matter which, the goal is to get a nice blue-grey, which we'll be applying to the cape. This is fairly straightforward, and we're just letting it mix on the model as we work top to bottom, eventually coming back for fresh paint to reinforce the brightness on the higher parts. It's definitely looking more blue than grey up there, but we can make adjustments once we have everything else blocked in. I'm likewise mixing some turquoise into the perylene black so we can make a mid-tone from the underlying green while also desaturating it. Texture really helps us here, as we're just gently over-brushing and letting the paint catch on. Adding some violet here will help really pull things back towards grey, as purple and green are complementary. Now it's starting to look less green overall, especially in the highlights. We're catching this on an even smaller area than before, focusing on the tips and the upward facing parts. I'm using a bit more radiant blue on the robes to subtly distinguish them slightly from the cloak. I've definitely added too much here, but you'll see shortly that it doesn't take much to correct. The main goal of this stage is to define our elements, and to make sure they stand out from each other. We can also add some brilliant yellow pale to the bottom of the cloak to give it a more dusty look, and to separate its highlights from those on the shoulders. Lastly, for the armour, I'll be adding brilliant yellow pale and using the edge of the brush to catch those sharp edges, and to block in the collar, which is largely grey. The yellow contrasts well against the blue of the robes and the violet highlights of the suit. Applying it sparingly on the edges also makes the surface look much more reflective, as opposed to the gradual blending we've done on the textiles. Again, it's better to overdo it than underdo it here, as we're looking to establish a roadmap from our initial value sketch. I didn't want the base to be too distracting, but I did want to give it some colour. So first I layered on some brilliant yellow pale, then added a touch of cadmium yellow into the Van Dyke brown. Now this proved far too saturated, but was easy enough to knock back down with more brilliant yellow pale, resulting in something in between. You can really experiment like this with oils, and I encourage you to do so, as often the only way to know is to try. Lastly, since it stands apart from the rest of the model, we can knock out the lightsaber. This similarly took some back and forth, playing with the red, just adding various amounts of yellow to brighten it, before finally coming in with some white for the core. There are a lot of different ways to paint lightsabers. I'm a fan of keeping the brightest part near the hilt, but you could absolutely extend it down the length. For the glow, the light tends to drop off significantly in intensity each time it doubles in distance from the source. While we can take some creative liberties with this, it's a handy guide to follow, and even the parts closest to the hilt aren't going to be quite as bright as the hilt itself, and those just a little farther back are going to be significantly less intense. And here he is with everything sketched in. All of our elements are clearly defined, looking distinct without being too far from black or grey. Next we're going to restore some of the darker tones, as well as neaten up a lot of the brush strokes that by now are quite visible. Restoring our darks is fairly straightforward. We're just taking some of our foundational colour of each element and brushing it back on the model in the areas that we want shaded. Because we have lighter tones out there, they'll quickly blend into more of that dark grey mid-tone, meaning we could easily control the gradient, and leave room for our darkest darks in the recesses. We can also paint on the darker areas of the collar, and quickly come back and highlight the brighter ones. Even though this section is focused on darks, it's also a good time to reinforce highlights or pick out areas you might have missed, like I did with the chain. Doing so will help you know what to shade next, so enjoy the back and forth. Using straight brilliant yellow pale on the edges of the armour allows us to push the contrast in a much more precise manner than with overbrushing, and really starts to sell that texture. Now for the brush strokes. If we take a soft round brush that is both clean and dry, we can tap in or scumble those areas that aren't as well blended as we'd like. This smooths things out and also eases some of our more abrupt transitions, like the one on the shin guard here. The trick is keeping the brush clean, and being careful not to apply too much pressure. Now, if you aren't filming like I am, you could prime the miniature in black instead of grey, and these marks would be far less obvious. However, a dark undercoat would make it harder to see the effect of your foundational layer, so there's give and take with each method. Take your time with this step, and gradually things will start to come together. Next we're going to take a long thin brush like this liner and thin our foundational colours down heavily to create a wash. We can apply this wash to the recesses to really get a separation going between our elements and to help everything stand out on its own. You'll know it's the right consistency once it slides off the brush. We don't want to brush it on here, we're just touching it to the joint and letting the capillary action take care of the rest. If we spill any, let it sit and we can blend it out once the bulk of the thinner has evaporated. Once I've applied the wash, I like to let it sit in the Mini for at least 15 minutes or so, giving it all a chance to settle. This also gives our eyes a chance to reset, as it's easy to get tunnel vision when working on one piece like this. Coming back to Vader, I can now see that the base is lacking a lot of definition. The lightsaber is also highlighted well from one angle, but not from the top, which is where most gamers are going to view it from, so I'll need to fix that. The contrast on the shin is also quite severe, so I need to decide whether I want the helmet to match it or vice versa. And there are just generally a few details that could do with either an additional highlight or touching up. So starting with the lightsaber, it's just a matter of wrapping that glow around. You want to be careful not to use too many strokes when applying the white, otherwise it'll quickly turn into a pink mush. Thick over thin here. The base gets a wash of black mixed into Van Dyke brown, again letting the texture work for me. As I get closer to Vader, I add more to create the impression of a shadow. Now in hindsight it would have been better to use indigo here for a more natural shade, but the technique would have been the same. While I have some OSL on the robe, the edge still needs some definition, so I'm touching that up here, being too careful not to take out the red and leaving a dark line in between. I opted to dial the shins down a bit, but to come back to the helmet with more dark anyway, just to up the contrast a little bit more. Some additional dark on the codpiece also makes it a bit less attention grabbing, and some final brilliant yellow pale and white highlights on the sharpest edges of the helmet really sell it as the brightest, most reflective part of the Mini. I also decided to go a bit old school here and give Vader's eyes a red tint, by thinning down some red and brown and glazing it over the lenses. A bolder red was then put with the light bright on his chest, as well as a green, which I mixed from the yellow and pearline black. And that about does it. Time to let him dry, and then to spray him with some matte varnish. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I hope this was useful to you, or at least interesting, and that you'll consider giving your own take on black a go. Painting black doesn't have to be monochromatic and boring, and by using a bit of colour theory, we can get some really interesting results, while keeping to an overall look and mood. So thank you very much for spending time with me here today. If you have any questions about any of the products or techniques I've talked about, or have a topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, I'd love to hear it. Again, thanks very much for your company, and take care.